Tonight we have a very special guest. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Steve Keen, head of the School of Economics at Kingston University in London. About a year and a half ago, I was fortunate enough to stumble upon debunking economics. And I know for me, as well as many others in the Pluralist Society, thankfully we have someone from Glasgow and here tonight. Debunking Economics is one of those important and motivating books. So if you haven't done so already, I'd really recommend treating yourself to a copy because it's a great book. So yeah, we've got lots to talk about tonight and I'm very excited to get stuck in. So without further ado, Professor Steve Keen.
Thanks, Rick. I'd better share the Scottish royalties, hadn't I? See how they go. Okay, well, of course, you're all studying economics, but I often make this case to people who are non-economics audience that economics has been on the nose in recent years. It's actually quite funny today, with there's actually a day, of course, the Nobel Prize being awarded. So economics tries to maintain a certain amount of status, but this is the opinion that a lot of people have of economics after the financial crisis for its failure to see it coming. Have you seen that article in The Guardian by Dietrich? Chaktabori? It's online, of course, check it out. I criticised him, actually said he's got it entirely wrong. It's not a 9,000 quid lobotomy, it's a 27,000 quid lobotomy. He only covered the first year costs. So there's obviously, you can argue that economists themselves justify not seeing the crisis coming by saying shocks like that are unpredictable. Therefore it comes from outside the economy and they can't be blamed for not seeing coming something from outside the economy. That's the neoclassical perspective. There's a very funny debate by people like yourselves, I think the Rethinking group in the Netherlands, you may have seen that on YouTube recently as well. Quite amusing to see the body language of their professor as they went through, arguing they should be taught more than just neoclassical, and he had a hard time comprehending that neoclassical was anything more than a particular subset, the real business cycle mob, and secondly that he should consider any of the other groups which he thought he said basically said they deserved as much respect as intelligent design does in biology, which I think went down pretty well with the students and me. Now, of course, there are many other approaches, and I sort of see these as the basic ones. The Austrian school, which is very similar to neoclassical, but rejects equilibrium and rejects the mad assumptions about knowledge that go with a lot of neoclassical models. The post-Keynesian school, which I'm seen as being a part of, but I have a foot in the evolutionary ecological camps as well. Complexity theory, which is what I'm really trying to bring into economics. I'm not the only one by far who's doing that, by the way. I'm just the one with the biggest mouth. Marxian economics, and though I'm critical of labour theory of value Marxism, I think a huge amount of merit exists in Marx's logic, though not very much in what's been done in his name since. Feminist economics and so on. And they all have plenty of points of divergence, but I'll focus on three that define how I think like an economist, which is totally outside the mainstream. First of all, non-equilibrium modelling. The whole idea of equilibrium modelling is a hangover from the 19th century. It's about time we threw it out. We're already 2 centuries past when that was a sensible way to model the economy or any system whatsoever. It's about time economics grew up. Also taking banks' debt and money seriously rather than rejecting them and treating anybody who talks about banks as a banking mystic, which is how Krugman nicknamed me a few years ago. I call him a barter mystic in return. And working out how we analyse monetary flows between sectors to work out whether things like the surplus pact. Incidentally, I just noticed that Jeremy Corbyn's team has said they're not going to support that pact. Have you seen that news? It just turned up a few minutes ago on my Twitter feed, so a bit of a change inside the Labor Party there. But I want to do all those three. It's going to be a bit of a heavy lecture in some ways, but I hope it isn't too hard before dinner. Okay. So if you look at the conventional economic models, I mean, I'm parodying what's done in first year and all in the undergraduate courses, of course, but it's a case of intersecting supply and demand curves, work out the equilibrium price, and onto the next problem in the exercise book. There's a wonderful paper, if you haven't all seen it, by one of the great non-orthodox economists in our time called Axel Leinhofen. Heard his name at all? Okay, some of you have. He has a wonderful paper called Life Among the Econ, which is written something like about 40 years ago now. It's a comedy. He's a brilliantly funny man, as well as quite a leader in multi-agent modelling and so on. And Leinhofer described the econ as being like a tribe in the frozen tundra up to the north who refused to have much to do with their neighbouring tribes, the Sociologues and the Polexogs and the Polsies and so on, because they don't do models. And models, according to Leinhofer, there are two sorts of models. There are two cults inside the tribe of the econ. And there's the cult of the micro, and its icon looks like this, with labels S and D for supply and demand. And here's the tribe of the macro, which has the ISLM argument, which ISLM are the two marks of the model. That seems to be the belief that everything has to happen in equilibrium. And if there's anything I want to break people out of, it's thinking that that's necessary or even desirable to model the economy that way. Now, whenever I say this, somebody, if I've got a neoclassical opponent, will come out and say, oh, you haven't seen XY model in the Journal of Political Economy of 2013. And I think it's very significant you haven't read that particular paper. So I have to go back and say, let's look at some of the, whenever economists are triumphantly saying what they do, equilibrium abounds in their concepts. So here's George Bush's chief economic advisor, Ed Lazaire. He's actually quite a nice bloke, I might say. I met him in Adelaide, and he's talking about the state of mind inside the Bush advisory panel when the crisis hit. He said it was sheer panic. Quite intriguing to get that from the horse's mouth. But before he got to the panic stage, he wrote a paper in 2000 called Economic Imperialism. The whole idea that economics should take over all the social sciences. And one of the reasons he said economics is superior to the other social sciences is this. Economic models adhere strictly to the importance of equilibrium as part of any theory. Then, after the crisis, you have, of all things, the American Congress held an inquiry into economic theory. I don't know if you all know that. The papers are online, of course, and one of the people they asked along was V.V. Char. He's one of the leading DSGE model builders inside the Federal Reserve, at least up to that stage he was. I think he got, in rather painful political circumstances, his job was terminated about 2 years ago, I believe. But talking to the Congress quite aggressively, he said that if you have an interesting story to tell in economics, you can tell it in the DSG equilibrium model. If you can't do it, your story is incoherent. So again, seeing equilibrium is an essential part of defining coherence in a model. And Roger Farmer, writing very recently, and Roger's sort of somebody who bends around the edges of mainstream economics but is still very much firmly in that methodology, saying Robert Lucas was exactly right when he argued that markets are always in equilibrium. Now, what that means is the flow of supply equals the flow of demand. But what economists interpret that as meaning is there are no stocks in car yards overnight. Okay? There's a big difference between those two propositions. One is a stock flow consistency, the other is a fantasy. So this whole idea that you can't have a model that doesn't generate an equilibrium, if it doesn't generate an equilibrium, a model's incoherent. I'm going to give it a little social example, which is quite a bit of fun. And I think you'll all know that I'm going to describe a couple. I'm calling them Romeo and Juliet for obvious reasons. But I'm going to put together a situation, ask you whether you think this is realistic or not from what you know about some of the relationships you've known and maybe even experienced. So imagine a couple where Romeo is the type who forgets his girlfriend when she's not there. Okay. But when she's around, he likes her company. You know people like that? Okay. Juliet, on the other hand, fantasises about Romeo when he's not there, but when he is there, he pisses her off a bit. You know somebody who behaves like that? Okay. You know any relationships that you might know the two couples have got those sort of dynamics? Well, if you put that together, a simple way of modelling out is to say that the change in Romeo's love is some constant times what his love currently is, which will be a negative constant because it decays in the absence of Juliet's affections, and plus another constant times Juliet's affections, well, that's a positive constant. And then for Juliet's, exactly the same structure but different signs. So when Romeo's not there, she fantasises, so her C is a positive. And when he is there, he's negative because he annoys her. So that's the basic mathematics of it. So I've got constants ranging between 1 plus 1 and minus 1, showing love by a positive number, indifference by 0, and hate by a negative number. What do you reckon happens? You've got to simulate these things to work it out. So I'll bring this up in my Minsky program, which has been designed for economic purposes, but it's part of a family of software that's existed since the early 1960s. Actually, late 1960s, invented by J. Forrester, if you know that name at all, from the MIT. And it was the very first use it was put to was to build the limits to growth model. Now, economists forgot about it from that point on. Forrester actually thought he'd help convert economists to non-equilibrium modelling by showing them how powerful it could be. Instead, they derided it and abused his assumptions and said all sorts of nonsense stuff about what was actually argued in the book. And then finally, engineers thought this is a cool idea. It was taken over by engineers like crazy. So the whole idea of modelling modelling dynamics using flowcharts as the basis of mathematical equations dominates engineering education these days. And it dominates how engineers build things. But economists have never seen it before, which I still find ridiculous. So what you get, if I simulate that system, let's do it slowly. So this graph is showing Juliet's love for Romeo on the vertical axis and Romeo's love for Juliet on the horizontal, and this is showing both their affections over time. And what you get are never-ending cycles. They go from loving each other to hating each other to loving each other to hating each other. Does that sound like any relationships you know? Okay. Does it make it incoherent or is it realistic? Okay. So this is the basic idea. When you want to model a realistic situation these days, you do it with dynamics. You don't go back to 19th century methods and believe you've got equilibrium there. Now, that's the basic story there, but economists have mistaken equilibrium for coherence. And okay, in the 19th century that was a reasonable mistake to make, but it's crazy to be making that same mistake 1.5 centuries later. You don't have to reach equilibrium in a coherent model, and the whole idea of dynamics these days is that you have far from equilibrium systems where you need to see what they do as they pass through time. So there's a mistake in identifying equilibrium with internal consistency. And I want to show you a simple model. I actually had it built, and I was going to run a movie of it, but I trust PowerPoint to crash on me on that point, so I've got to do it live in front of you. I'll do a bit and then I'll go on and show you the actual simulation. But so imagine a simple, the simplest possible model in some ways, which is actually Richard Goodwin's model of the trade cycle from 1967. But you say capital stock, roughly speaking, determines what output you can produce. Output, roughly speaking, determines how many employees you need given labour productivity. Employment determines the rate of change of wages, so there's a Phillips curve expression inside there. Output minus wages gives you profit, and profit determines investment. And you've got a causal cycle there. It's the basic idea of a dynamic model. You start from a particular point, you get back to that point passing through functions that give you rates of change of variables. Investment, of course, determines the capital stock. That's what gets you back there again. If I try building it in Minsky, I'll very rapidly demonstrate the program. And given the amount of time, I'm not going to finish the whole thing. I'll just do a start of it here. But the basic concept in these programs is you build equations using flowcharts. And the flowcharts have got elements which are effectively like integral versions of differential equations. If I did label this as K and give it a value of 300, that's capital stock. And then if I say if I divide capital stock by an accelerator relationship, I'll give that a value of 3, then I can determine output. And if I then divide output by population, and the way I do that I need a divide by key. So you basically type everything you want onto a palette and then drag to connect items together. And you're actually defining a set of equations here. So I now bring in one more here and say if I divide output by population, I've got to give a value to this, otherwise the program will give me an error. So I'll give that a value, say 100. And then that will now, pardon me, that's a mistake there, so I'll delete that extra line. What I've got to do is first of all to say output divided by labour productivity. And I'll give that value 1 worker per unit of output. And on I'm going. Now what I'm actually defining here, I finally got to the stage I've defined the employment rate. So if I use the Greek letter lambda to illustrate that, it's designed so you can type in latex, so you can type symbolic code like you get in math type on the PC. So that's the basic idea of building a model. As I'll show you later, you can also include banks inside the system, and banks use double entry bookkeeping, etc., etc. So a few other tricks that don't exist. That's the trick that doesn't exist in the other programs. What it's generating is a set of differential equations for you. If I keep on going and I'd complete the graph I'll show you in the next slide here. So what you get when you put that model together, I have capital divided by the accelerator, giving you capital output ratio, giving you the amount of output you produce. Divide by labour productivity, you get the number of workers you hire. Divide by population, you get the employment rate. This is a linear Phillips curve, so there's no nonlinearities in the behavioural assumptions here, and that'll be very important in what I show later. If you then multiply the wage change function by the wage and integrate it, you get the wage level. Multiply that by labour, you've got the wage bill. Subtract that from output, you get profit. In the simple model, all profit is invested. I then take depreciation out, and investment minus depreciation is the rate of change of capital stock. That's the basic sort of logic. It takes about 10 minutes to build that model, if I actually had 10 minutes free. So you don't have to have equilibrium. That's one of many. It's the simplest model in economics that doesn't have an equilibrium. It'll cycle indefinitely. And I think this is the reality of the economy as well. We're trying to push something which is a non-equilibrium phenomena into an equilibrium straitjacket, and it fails completely for that reason, on that reason alone. So what I've added, the way that I built my model of Minsky some years ago, actually 23 years ago now to be roughly precise, so it's August 1992 I first finished building that model. I'd said, what if capitalists don't invest all their profits, which was the simple assumption Goodwin made in that model? Well, if they don't invest all their profits, they invest more during a boom than you do during a slump. Simple relationship. And that means they've got to borrow money to fund the difference. So as well as saying there's these cyclical relations for wages and employment, I added one more in saying that the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. And they've got to pay interest on that, so you now need to redefine your model to include the repayment of debt. Now, it's exactly the same model I've mentioned a moment ago, but I've now added down here a rate of profit leading to a profit rate where there's an equilibrium level, or a normal level I prefer to use, or maybe I need some letter other than equilibrium. If anybody can give me another word over drinks later on, I'd gratefully accept it. That gives you the gap between desired and the rate of profit. That means they simply invest what they earn, and the rate of profit will invest more if it's higher, less than it's lower than that. A reaction function giving you investment, which then gives you investment minus profits, but if investment exceeds profits, you borrow money. You then charge interest on the money you've borrowed, which means your profits are now net of interest payments. Now, this is an entirely linear model, and I'll take you through it in a bit more detail later, but what did you think is going to happen with an entirely linear model like that? You've got to simulate it to see. And what you get, this is the employment rate here, this is wages here. Notice the cycles of employment are getting smaller. If you're a neoclassical economist, you might call that a great moderation. Okay? Cycles in wages are getting smaller as well, and that's a proxy for inflation in this model. And it's diminishing, which means two things. Inflation is falling and workers are getting less money, but as we all know, the basic attitude is who cares about workers anyway. So there's never any worry about workers' share of income falling. Notice what's happening to the cycles now, though. They start getting larger. So this is a model generating both what appears to be a convergence towards equilibrium, but then a breakdown on the other side. And those cycles will now get larger and larger and larger, and I'll take you through a bit of the logic of that. But you cannot get that out of an equilibrium model. That sort of behaviour is simply impossible in a model that presumes equilibrium. But I think it's what happened in the real economy. Because if you take a look back at the last 30 years, looking from the perspective of 2007 and prior, what neoclassical economists like Bernanke saw was a tremendous improvement in the economy. They're happy to nickname the Great Moderation and take the credit for it. So he said he reckons there's controversial as to what caused it, but improved control of inflation has contributed in large measure to this welcome change in the economy. This is what he saw happening. Falling cycles in employment and inflation, which they extrapolated on forever, and then, holy crap, Batman, where did this come from? Suddenly an explosion in employment and a collapse into deflation. What they're ignoring all the way through is the rising level of private debt, which is being recorded by the Federal Reserve, but ignored by Federal Reserve economists because, according to them, the level of private debt shouldn't matter. So I think when you put those phenomena together, you see something very much like what we saw in the real world, turning up an incredibly simple non-equilibrium model. Now, there's been a lot of soul-searching amongst neoclassical economists. Much of that has resulted in them adding financial frictions and no more than that to their models and thinking that's all they need to do. But occasionally you find intriguing statements like this. And this is Olivier Blanchard writing last year, saying that there's this obsession with not just equilibrium models but also linear models. He said, we did think of the economy as roughly linear, subject to different shocks, fluctuating but returning to its natural steady state over time. And talking about the business cycle rather than fluctuations, and said when we started developing techniques to deal with nonlinearities within an equilibrium framework, which makes it incredibly complicated, the benign view remained largely dominant. So doesn't that sort of imply we should embrace nonlinearity? And I mean not behavioural nonlinearity, but structural. I'll explain that in a moment. Well, he finally says, should we modify our benchmark models to describe how the economy behaves in what he calls dark corners? And his answer was, Well, maybe no, because trying to do that is probably beyond our conceptual and technical reach at this stage. Now, it's only beyond the conceptual and technical reach because they continue using technical and conceptual means that prevent them realising these dynamics through non-equilibrium systems. So it's the linear paradigm itself, the linear equilibrium paradigm itself, that means they can't see it. It's extremely easy, painfully easy, to do that in the simplest possible way. That model I've shown you a moment ago, I can actually state as a set of identities. I knew two of the three. I've only worked out the third one was an identity just recently because I looked at this complicated expression for the debt ratio and thought one day there's got to be something simpler behind it, and it gave me quite a surprise when I realised how simple it was. So the first equation, which is about the rate of change of employment, says the employment rate will rise, percentage rate of employment will rise, if economic growth exceeds the sum of labour productivity and population growth. That's simply a fact coming from the definitions. Second is that the wages share of output will rise if wage demands exceed the growth in labour productivity. And the third is, this is the one that I've reworked from what looked like a complicated expression into an incredibly simple one. The ratio of private debt to GDP will rise if private debt grows faster than GDP. They simply can't contradict those. They're simply facts. When you put together in equations and using dots above the variables to indicate 1 over variable d variable dt, so 1 over x dx dt, or a log linear system. That's the employment rate. That's the rate of change of output, real output. There's growth in labour productivity, and there's population growth. And then the wages share of output, there are wage demands, and finally you've got the debt ratio, and that's the rate of change of private debt minus the rate of growth of the real economy. And then putting it into a simple set of, just to show that these are all expansions of identities. The equations on the left-hand side, or the term on the left-hand side is simply, so the right hand is simply expansion of what's on the left-hand side. So it's what I go through and indicate each stage there. And Brian's got a copy of this. Have you got a copy of this bit? I think you have. I'll give you this one later. Okay. So those are all the various terms. It's just simply expanding a set of identities. So at that point you can't object to the model, nor can you say anything about it. You have to simulate this to see what it does actually give you. So those are the bits and pieces there. So to make it simulable, I've got to put in some definitions, and this is where I get both the Great Moderation and the Great Recession coming out of the model, with rising private debt, rising inequality. But out of an incredibly simple model, it doesn't require rational expectations. In fact, I call that prophetic expectations. The simplest possible model of behaviour gives these results. So it's emphasising the importance of getting the structure of the economy right, rather than fantasies about the behaviour of agents in the model, which is what dominates neoclassical economics and also to some extent the behavioural world. So I start by saying output is a linear function of the capital stock, which of course is simpler than it actually is. But bringing in capacity utilisation amplifies the results I show here. Investment is a linear function of the profit rate. Again, nothing complicated at all about the behaviour of capitalists. Employment's a linear function of output. Wage change is a linear function of the employment rate. Change in debt is just investment minus profits. I have no Ponzi speculation going on there, no government sector, and crucially, no bankruptcy. Now, when I'm talking about nonlinearities, I said structural rather than behavioural so beforehand. The nonlinearity has come out of multiplying one variable by another. Wages times labour is the wage bill. Okay? The rate of change of debt includes interest on debt, which is an exponential term. So these elements are structural. There are no nonlinearities in the model itself that generate these results. So there's capital as a linear, output is a linear function of capital, a straight linear capitalist profit function or investment function, employment a linear function of output again, and wage change a linear Phillips curve, which is not what Phillips argued for, but it just shows how much you don't need complicated behavioural relations to generate these results. And finally, change in debt being investment minus profits. Now, if I put that all together into a Minsky model and then put it together in equations, that might look complicated compared to your usual supply and demand type expressions, but there's only three variables inside there: the employment rate, the wages share of output, and the debt ratio, and there are 9 constants. You can see the rate of them that are identified there. The 9th is the rate of interest, which is included in the definition of the rate of profit. But what you get out of this is complex behaviour, and this is the essence of complex systems analysis. You don't need complicated rules to get complicated structure. It's interactions between variables that give you complex behaviour from simple rules. And interestingly enough, the first thing that I noticed about this when I built it some decades ago is that the variables and the equilibria were not the same. So the variables in this are the employment rate, the debt ratio, and the wages share of output. The equilibria are the employment rate, the debt ratio, and the profit share of output. And I think this is an important element of why we were so fooled by the Great Moderation, because if you're looking at it from the point of view of investors and capitalists and government managers and so on, the rate of profit was relatively stable. Workers were getting less, but nobody cared about them until after Piketty, until after the financial crisis as well. What turns out of this model is the wages share is a direct residual. So profit tends to be bouncing around in equilibrium, and I'll show you what happens there in a moment. But there's a direct negative relationship between workers' share of output and the level of private debt and the rate of interest on it as well, even though in this model workers are doing no borrowing whatsoever. So it ends up being the workers who are paying for the higher level of debt in the economy by a lower income share. And that's something you don't find in Piketty. So the good equilibrium, bit of a mess, okay, like all these things, you get complicated terms out of expressions like this. One intriguing element of this that I've just point out in passing, I was giving a full course on this, I'd go into more detail obviously. The equilibrium debt ratio, the denominator there is the sum of labour productivity growth and population growth. Now if both those head towards zero, the equilibrium debt level heads towards infinity. And it becomes unstable as well. So an intriguing little side effect there, secular stagnation has partly to do with the level of private debt. Now there are two possible outcomes of this model depending upon the parameter values. Remember again, there's no nonlinearity in the behaviour here, it's all structural. One is the equilibrium is stable. And what then happens is you get a cyclical convergence over time to a positive employment rate, a positive profit share, and a finite debt ratio. It looks like this. Notice the cycle's getting smaller. Ditto for the profit rate. And the level of debt rises but then tapers to a maximum level of, in that case, 60% of GDP. And when you put it in three dimensions, that's the sort of behaviour you get, which is a stable equilibrium. Now that's the sort of thing now classical economists assume, even when the models give them unstable. The DSGE model's fundamental equilibrium is unstable. It's one thing they managed to trample over, breaking all the rules of mathematics and doing it. But that's what you get out of this model, genuinely, dynamically, when the parameters give you stability. Here's the other possibility, which I've just shown you a moment ago. Falling cycles followed by rising cycles again, which if you don't know complex systems literature is mystifying. The same thing happening to the profit rate. It cycles around for a while, seems to be heading towards equilibrium, and then explodes. What you've got going on is a rising level of private debt to GDP, which finally leads to a breakdown. And when you graph this thing in three dimensions, this is the shape you get, with the vertical axis being the ratio of private debt to GDP. Now, when I first did this as doing my PhD, I had a wonderful econometrician, Eric Soey, who's one of my teachers in the master's course, and a lovely, lovely guy. And Eric took one look at that and said, "Steve, if you've identified anything that exists in genuine capitalism, we're in deep, deep trouble." I just thought it was a fun model. I didn't expect it to happen. Well, what's actually going on there, that strange behaviour, was identified by fluid dynamicists about 40, 50 years ago, and it's named after them, Pommeau-Maneville, or inverse tangent route to chaos. And what they saw it was in looking at the transition between smooth flow and turbulent flow in water, one of the three dimensions can be described as a process of bouncing between a straight line and a curve. Now, if the straight line crosses the curve, there are two equilibria. The lower one is stable, you'll get laminar flow out of that. The higher one is unstable. If you're above it, you'll get more turbulent flow. So the dynamics are determined whether the curve intersects or not. If it does intersect and you're bouncing between the line and the curve, you'll reach the equilibrium if you come from below it. And there'll be no fluid turbulence, and in our case there'd be no economic instability. When you have non-intersection, you bounce through it, turbulence seems to be declining, and then it explodes, and the same thing with the economy. you get a period of instability preceded by diminishing cycles, which is what fooled the mainstream to believe they were getting towards nirvana. So this is the way it's shown in the Pommeau-Maniville paper. That's the basic process. It's actually it's a technical thing called a Poincaré map to try to explain the dynamics of a system. You can see the basic similarity to what I showed with my model, because we had this period of diminishing cycles and then rising again. So rather than being two separate events, which is the way neoclassicals are treating them, one due to good economic policy, the other due to an exogenous shock, they're two stages in the same process from the point of view of the model I'm putting forward here. Now, one weakness of the model, I'm sure some of you are thinking this right now, is it had booms as well as busts. Whereas the real world experience, we only had apparent moderation and then a bust. And I was aware of this when I did the model, but I'm a bit of a stickler for wanting to derive things properly. I could have slotted in Koleski's pricing equation, put a dynamic version of that, and then modelled prices, but I didn't do it until ages later. I finally derived from a strict monetary model, as it turned out, exactly the same pricing equation. So when I add the pricing equation inside there, I now generalise those three statements to include inflation. And here you'll get the employment rate will rise if real economic growth exceeds population growth and labour productivity. The wages share of output will rise if money wage demands exceed inflation plus growth and labour productivity, and the private debt will rise if the rate of growth of nominal debt exceeds the sum of inflation plus the rate of economic growth. So it's still derived from undeniable identities. All you can deny is the relevance of the third equation. Now I needed additional equations for the rate of inflation, for a variable nominal interest rate, and I used the simplest possible relationships again. I have a lag convergence to equilibrium prices in a monetary economy, which is Koleski's equation put in a dynamic sense, and a lagged inflation premium to a base rate of interest. And that's the basic equation for the price dynamics. Now it gets to be a more complicated model, but trust me, it's the simplest model you can build. Okay, what's going on there includes an inflation-adjusted nominal interest rate, a first-order time lag determining inflation, so inflation slowly converges towards that equilibrium markup, inflation affecting the wages share of output, and also affecting the rate of growth of debt, and then finally a lagged reaction interest rates to the actual inflation rate. So it is, though it might look complicated, it's actually quite a simple model. But when you put that together, it's four-dimensional, so it's much harder to analyse technically. But it appears to yield this fundamental instability even with linear equations. So now if I simulate the employment rate, that's the sort of behaviour I get. A period of cycles get a bit bigger, start getting smaller, equilibrium's been arrived at, thank God we can all relax and the economy dies. Okay. The same thing for the rate of inflation. And intriguingly, the same thing for the rate of profit. Capitalists are the last ones to know the system is about to crash. And what they're still looking at, their point of view, everything's wonderful. And what's going on behind it is this exponential increase in the level of debt after you get past a certain level, which is about 200% of GDP, which is the level England achieved in the last bubble, and it's trying to get back there again. Graph it in 3 dimensions, and this is the sort of behaviour you see. Now again, this is just with linear models there. Nonlinear functions are brought in not because you need nonlinear functions to get the behaviour you are trying to achieve, which is the way I imagine a lot of neoclassical economists think, not what nonlinearity actually means. No, it's simply saying you want more realism. So if you have a linear function for investment as a function of the rate of profit, what you're arguing is below a certain level of profit, capitalists go about smashing up factories. No, they don't. They might not use them, but they don't smash them up. Okay? So a linear equation involves those sorts of nonsense assumptions. A nonlinear equation says below a certain rate of profit they stop investing. That's all. Above it they invest at an accelerating rate. And what you get out of it is again a much more subtle system of cycles, apparent growth in cycles, apparent disappearance of them, and then a breakdown. This is the inflation rate. Everything looks wonderful until you fall into permanent deflation. It runs at an average of 6% there in that particular model. And the profit rate, the same sort of story. The capitalists are the last ones to know their system is about to crash. And the reason, again, is the bankers are taking everything, which is the situation we find ourselves in now with the dominant financial sector. In 3 dimensions, that's what it looks like. So again, capturing the basic dynamics of the last 40 years, in what is actually quite a simple model. Now, if it hadn't been for the financial crisis and the period of great moderation beforehand, this would just be a mathematical curiosity. But I built this model in 92, before the crisis, before the great moderation was recognised. So it wasn't a case of me trying to fit the model to data. The data fitted itself to the model. And that's a scary thing to have happen when you do mathematical modelling. So you had this apparent period of tranquility and then a sudden crisis. And that's what we see in the real world. Now, the other intriguing thing, that income distribution has become a major topic in recent decades, I reckon years, thanks to Piketty. And here's a fairly simple causal mechanism behind it, the R greater than G argument. This actually comes up with a much stronger mechanism, saying that the profit share in this system will cycle around an equilibrium because there's a declining amount going to workers, which is perfectly offset by the rising amount going to bankers. So capitalists don't see any overall change in they're paying more out in interest, they're paying less out in wages. Overall, they're getting the same share of the surplus. What actually is going on with the falling workers' share is you're getting closer and closer to deflation because the major determinant of the rate of inflation is the workers' share of output. And what you will get is this sort of dynamics where there's a small decline in workers' share occurring over time, matched by a small increase in bankers' share, leading to the period of equilibrium, and then you get a complete collapse in workers' share and an explosion in bankers' share because bankers are taking over the whole system. Of course, this is a system without bankruptcy. And one of the points I'm making from this model and from what we've seen happening is we have to write off debt. Okay? But we can't do it in a systemic way because that actually leads to a further crisis. Notice that equilibrium profit rate there. If I now do the non-linear version, one little curiosity I want to point out there, it's very hard for you to see, but the red line slightly above the blue is the equilibrium value for profit. The actual level is below the equilibrium all the time. And this is another feature you can get out. You can't get out of a linear model. A linear model, if it has cycles, will fluctuate around the equilibrium. But a non-linear system, where you have non-linear behavioural relations, that's the important second point here, it's a function of the variables that's being driven by the system, not the actual variables themselves. So you can get the equilibrium and the average being different. So if you measured the average for this system and the equilibrium, they would not be the same. Again, you can't get that with linear thinking. So that's 1/3 of my talk, and I think I've been through it. How much of we time have we got here? Okay, I might dive over the last. So I've got two possibilities. I can show you why Krugman's wrong about loanable funds, or I can talk about why you should run a government deficit. Which one would you prefer? The deficit? Okay, all right. I'll page on a bit. I can do loanable funds in a flash, so I'll do that in a flash because it's worth bringing up. Because we're having a little illustrate the power of the approach we've taken in modelling with Minsky, where we can include banking and double entry bookkeeping directly. So I built a model here that includes Krugman's fantasy of loanable funds, where a non-bank agent lends to another non-bank agent. In this case, the consumer sector lends to the investment sector. And these are controls that I have here on the rate of lending. The smaller the number, the faster lending doubles. And this is the rate of repayment. The smaller the number, the faster repayment occurs. And if I simulate this model, oh great. Okay, I must have brought those, without meaning it, I brought something down from the... Oh, there we go, that's what I've done. Accidentally put that arrow... Uh-oh. I think it'll still work, let's see. Yep, it still works, okay, good. Right. Okay, so what we have is a system which hits a growth rate. Notice the GDP is flatlining at 200. No change in GDP in nominal terms. Minsky crashes on me, that's great. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. Alright, let's try that again. Right, we're okay at this stage. So if I now accelerate lending, notice the growth rate dropped. And the level of debt's rising now. Debt now exceeds the available money supply. No apparent change to GDP. If I have an incredible slowdown in the rate of repayment, lending again explodes. GDP slows down a bit. If you then have a rapid increase in repayment and an incredible slowdown in lending, a couple of spikes to the rate of growth of the economy. But overall, debt and banks and money are a non-issue, which is exactly the attitude that neoclassicals have to it. So restoring the original situation, we've had a huge increase in lending and a huge decline. dramatic increase in debt and a fall, and bugger all change to GDP. So that's the loanable funds, and my little point here is that if they were right that lending is from one non-bank agent to another non-bank agent, you could ignore the banking sector. But because it's nonsense that that's what happens. Yes, there is some lending like that, but most lending is from a bank to a non-bank. So I can rapidly come in here and say the loan is not an asset for the consumer sector, it's an asset of the bank. Delete these operations that imply lending between the investment sector and the consumer sector. Then come to the banking sector and say the debt is actually an asset of the bank. It's not an asset of the investment of the consumer agent. Say that interest payments are made to the bank rather than the consumer agent. Get rid of the bank fee. Reset the system and start all over again. And notice for a start I've got a growth rate. The increasing debt is causing an increase in the amount of the money supply. If I have an increase in lending and a decrease in the rate of repayment, the rate of growth accelerates. If you then have a slowdown increase in how fast people repay their debts and a slowdown in lending, GDP will come down as well, and then it recovers on the other side. You get back to a recovery again. So I've got a feeling arguing that banks lend money is fairly important to macroeconomics after doing that. So that's the lightning demonstration of what I was going to take 15 minutes to do, but we can talk about that later. That's partly why I built Minsky, to enable us to analyse issues like that. Well, let's talk about the should the governments run a surplus idea now. And of course, politics, that was pretty much Labor versus the Conservatives. Okay. And the mainstream logic behind this is what they call Ricardian equivalence, which was a piece of nonsense invented by Robert Barrow about 30 years ago to try to get rid of Italian trade unions so he can get his villa fixed up properly in Italy. I'm not joking. Okay. So he argued the deficits today have to be financed by future taxes. And in this he said that this is the actual logic. A deficit finance cut in current taxes leads to higher future taxes. The cut in today's taxes must be matched by a corresponding increase in the present value of future taxes. This is his logic. Suppose now, one of my students used to say that this was when a better word for imagine or let's assume is let's pretend. Okay, because there's actually a fantasy going on here. Suppose now that household demands for goods depends upon expected present value of taxes. Therefore, the substitution of a budget deficit for taxes has no impact on aggregate demand for goods. The current budget deficit leads to an offsetting increase in desired private saving and no change in national saving. That was the argument to utilise the whole thing about budget multipliers and so on. If we assume, of course somebody pointed out that his assumption we put aside money to pay taxes later assumes we live forever. And that's not true. He said, oh yes, that's fair enough, but what actually happens is a network of intergenerational transfers that makes a typical fat person part of an extended family that goes on indefinitely. All I have to ask about this is, what on earth was he smoking? You know? So this total nonsense is easily shown to be nonsense. And this is a little exercise. I'm trying to raise funding, by the way. Hi, talk about this later. To run a little video which would have people in a pub normally come out and agree that a surplus is a good idea. So I want to film them saying that and have me come up and say I can prove you wrong in 2 minutes on a beer coaster. So the idea is, here's the beer coaster argument. Consider a government running a surplus, which is what, of course, politicians want to do, and that's the pact that Cameron wants to force the Labor Party to agree to. Well, a surplus means government taxes are greater than government spending. Now, if you think of that in a monetary sense, that means there's a net flow of money from the private sector to the government sector. So let's call this net gov. And this is the point the modern monetary theory have been making for a long time, but I want to elaborate a bit. So a government surplus means a private deficit, meaning if the government's going to put more money in, take more money out of your bank accounts by taxing you than it pays back by welfare payments and the like, then you're going to have a flow between the two sectors. So take a rectangle, this is what I'm going to do on the back of a beer coaster, divide it in two, call one half private sector and the other half the government. And then if you're going to have a surplus of net gov for the government sector, there's going to be a deficit of net gov for the private sector. It's simply accounting. That's the beginning of it. There's a flow there. Now that alone surprises most people, because most people think if the government saves, so can I. No, if the government saves, it's taking money out of your bank account. But if that keeps on going, how do you keep it going permanently? Well, there's two ways. Either the public happily watches its bank accounts fall down to zero, which of course it won't do, or it borrows the money from the banks. So you've got to divide that private sector into two halves now. So if there's going to be the private sector running a deficit by having this transfer of money to the government sector, then to keep the amount of money in private bank accounts constant, you have to borrow money from the banks. And I've called this the banks running a deficit, which simply means loans exceed repayments. That's necessary if you're going to keep the amount of money in the people's bank accounts constant. So call that net bank. You can then say the deficit in the loans exceeding repayments there means that there can be balance in the private sector because net gov and net bank cancel each other out and the government continues running a surplus. But a condition of that is that the private sector gets increasingly in debt to the banking sector. But it's also incompatible with a growing economy to begin with, because I'm assuming here they're simply topping up their bank accounts and not increasing them. So the only way you can get growth out of an economy like that, where there's a constant amount of money, is if the turnover rate of that money, however you measure it, increases over time, which means a rising velocity of money. Now, if you look at the empirical data, this is the sort of trend you see. There was a rise in the velocity of circulation of what's called MZM, money of zero maturity, from a bit under 2 up to 3.5 from 1960 to 1980, but it's been downhill all the way since. So if you actually have a constant stock of money, you're going to have a declining nominal GDP on current data trends. So if you're going to have a government surplus and the private sector only borrows enough to replenish what the government's taking out of it, then you're going to get no economic growth and maybe a contraction, but a rising level of private debt to GDP, which means at some time in the future you're going to have a financial crisis. That's the impact of running a government surplus. So if you want to get growth in that crazy situation, which is what we're trying to do, then the public has to borrow more money from the banks than it's giving to the government in a surplus. Then you could have a growing economy in that situation, but of course you have an even faster rate of growth at the level of private debt. Now it's got to be faster than the rate of growth of GDP and faster than the no growth case as well. So the medium-term consequences of running a sustained government surplus is going to be a rising level of private debt to GDP and then ultimately an economic crisis, because the private sector, either the banking half or the customers or both, will decide that's enough debt and the lending stops and the economy tanks. Now that's the opposite of what people who are fans of surpluses believe. They believe that the surplus means good economic management. No, it means setting up the economy for a future financial crisis. So if you have and what happens in that case, if the government continues trying to take money out of the economy, which is what the EU is imposing upon Greece right now, and people are repaying the debt in their banks at the same time, then you've got two ways in which money is declining in people's private bank accounts. And with a declining amount of money, you're going to have an economic contraction. And that's not just hypothetical. I know we all focus on Greece's public debt level and everything the government's done, etc., etc. But this is the data for the rate of change of private debt as percentage of GDP and the unemployment rate, which of course I've turned upside down so you can see the correlation more clearly. So what's actually been driving the Greek economy down isn't just the government running a surplus when it shouldn't. It's the private sector massively deleveraging. And the deleveraging hasn't stopped, whereas it has stopped in America and England. And that's why you've got a bit of a revival going on there, though hardly one to crow about. So even a balanced budget is a bad idea, because that means private debt will grow at least as fast as GDP and probably faster, because you're outsourcing all the money creation responsibilities to the banks. Now, hands up those who think the banks have done a good job in the last 20 years. Okay? But that's what we have. That's implicitly lying behind the argument that the government shouldn't create money, which is what is actually going on when you say the government should run a surplus. You're saying it should destroy money. Running a government surplus says the government's proper role is to destroy some of the money supply every year. That's nonsense. So what's wrong about that? It's our vision of seeing the government as being like a household, when in fact the government is effectively like a bank. In fact, it's a super bank, because it's the only institution that owns its own bank. Okay? It can pay its bills in notes it can print. It's got the classic right of seniorage. Not even the banks have that. So the sustainable situation for a growing economy is that the two money producers in the economy should be both producing money for the non-bank private sector to use. Banks ordinarily should lend out more than they get back in repayments. Governments ordinarily should have a deficit. that provides the money supply that's then spent by the public sector, the private industry. Now, of course, the government can do that badly, all sorts of nonsense like that, but that would mean about a 2 or 3 or maybe even 4% of GDP increase in spending into the economy. And I think that might go a long way to reducing the level of unemployment. So my main concern remains the level of private debt today, because we've let ourselves into a private debt trap. Again, economics has helped us ignore the major determinant of the state of the economy. And that's why we have to reform neoclassical economics, because it's actually dangerous for the health of capitalism. And I want to just give you an idea of just how big this debt level is. The only reliable records of debt, as in well-documented records, have been kept by the Federal Reserve since 1945, after Copeland put together the flow of funds. Brilliant piece of accounting and reporting by the American financial system. Before that, the census had a set of data which you can also locate for lending, and then before that there was bank loan data also kept for a number of banks, but not the entire banking sector in America. So what I had to do, and if you looked at those levels, the level of debt back in the Great Depression was much higher than today. But when you look at the overlap, there's an overlap from 1945 until 1970 between the census data and the Federal Reserve, and the census data is uniformly above the Federal Reserve and moves in the same direction. So what I've done is I've normalised the data working backwards. This is a long-winded explanation for the chart I'm about to show you, which you won't find in raw data, but I think I can justify how it's been constructed. The public debt is actually accurate recorded data. That's the level of private debt. The red line is the private debt ratio in America. From 1945 on, that's using just Federal Reserve data. And when you go back to here I'm talking about census data, but you can see where once you've done the normalisation, we're trying to begin a revival of the economy from a level of private debt that exceeds the level it reached at the peak of the Great Depression, thanks to 3 years of serious deflation. And you've also had a rising level of government debt coming on at the moment. So the level of indebtedness of the global economy is enormous, mainly in the private debt. That's the one that's dangerous. But we have to find a way of reducing that. And I want to now give you a bit of an idea of why this matters. With a historical record we can actually look back at today, and that's what's happened in Japan. Because Japan was a bit like the Spanish Civil War was the dress rehearsal for the Second World War. Japan's bubble economy bursting was the dress rehearsal for what we've been through subsequently. We learnt nothing from Japan's experience. And you normally talk about the level of government debt in Japan. That's the blue line. Notice how low that was compared to private debt until after the crisis began for them, which was 1990. So you had a level of rising private debt reaching 225% of GDP, then a long period of declining debt, and then it stabilised at about 175% of GDP. And all the way through, the government's been trying pump priming to revive the economy. It stopped it having a total depression, as Richard Koo argues, but it hasn't caused a revival because they haven't got rid of that level of private debt. Now, this is the correlation of the change in private debt and the level of unemployment in Japan since 1965. And whenever I do charts like this, even my jaw still continues hitting the floor because the correlations are so extreme. Minus 0.91 between change in debt and the level of unemployment over 50 years. Okay? So what we're ignoring, courtesy of mainstream economics, is incredibly strong data. That's why I said we have to reform economics, because the ignorance it's causing is causing the crisis we're now in. So I want you to break away from the mainstream, agitate as much as you like. Speaking as somebody who sat in a professor's chair before he was a professor, I recommend a certain amount of direct action. Okay? And read some critical books. We had a mention of debunking economics beforehand. It's not the only one out there. I recommend this one by ex-physicist George Cooper, good mate of mine now in England, and Paul Ormerod as well, another good friend, much more conservative in politics than I am, but he's very progressive on complex systems analysis and so on. So there's a wealth of other ways to do economics, and it's about time we learn from other disciplines as well, including physics and biology and ecology there. But keep an open mind. I think it's a wonderful statement I remembered when I was giving my talk to my first-year students from Hamlet, when Horatio was banging on about 1500s equivalent to neoclassical economics, and exasperated Hamlet turns to him and says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Well, that's unfortunately extremely the case with neoclassical economics. Thank you.